In medieval Europe, sex wasn't just private, it was political, celestial, and criminal. You could be punished for thinking impure thoughts, executed for sleeping with your own spouse on the wrong day. They believed lust summoned demons, that stars controlled conception, that a man's failure in bed might be proof of witchcraft, and behind closed cathedral doors, the same church that condemned desire, licensed brothels, taxed sin, and turned salvation into business. These weren't just bizarre beliefs. They were systems of control designed to tame the human body, regulate the womb, and terrify the soul. Today, we uncover 6 of the strangest, darkest sexual sins in the medieval world. Not to provoke, not to moralize, but to reveal how deeply culture, fear, and power entwined between the sheets. Before we descend into the shadows, click like and subscribe to join history's hidden horrors, where the past never rests in peace. Imagine falling in love, under surveillance, a dim cottage, a creaking floor, a winter wind tapping at the shutters, and in the middle of the room, 2 young lovers fully clothed lying stiffly in bed. Between them, a heavy wooden board nailed in place. At the foot of the bed, her parents, sitting, watching, praying. This wasn't punishment. This was courtship. In the medieval world, where sex outside of marriage was a sin, punishable by shame, or worse, young couples faced a paradox. How could you fall in love? Without ever touching enter the solution, no one asked for bundling. A practice that let couples share a bed, but only with physical barriers and moral supervision. In some homes, that meant a literal plank of wood separating the bodies. In others, lovers were sewn into separate sack-like garments tied at the neck. Romantic Sanctioned, surprisingly. Yes, bundling was practiced in England, Wales, the Low Countries, and eventually even by Puritan settlers in New England. To the medieval mind, it offered just enough closeness to spark affection, but not enough to tempt the devil. At least that was the theory. Because in practice, people are people. Wood breaks, sacks loosen, curtains don't muffle everything. And when pregnancies happened, and they did, the burden of blame fell almost always on the woman. But why allow this strange ritual in the first place? Because in the Middle Ages, marriage was a contract. Land inheritance alliances all rode on the outcome. Bundling became a way for families to test compatibility, particularly when dowries and bloodlines were involved. In noble circles, bundling was unnecessary. Wealthy marriages were often arranged by contract and consummated under far stranger conditions, sometimes with witnesses present to verify the act. A few unlucky couples even endured public bedding ceremonies where the act itself was legally acknowledged by a crowd gathered outside the room. But for commoners, bundling offered a sliver of control. If the girl conceived the family had leverage and a likely father, bundling became a soft form of insurance cloaked in morality, enforced by ritual. It wasn't about purity. It was about control. The medieval fear wasn't sex. It was unsupervised sex. Pleasure without permission, desire without documentation. So society built fences, literal and spiritual, around the human body. And bundling was one of its most quietly cruel inventions. Because even in moments meant for closeness, laughter, or warmth, the church, the family, and the village were always in the room. Imagine whispering to someone you care about while your father dozes by the hearth. Imagine feeling your heartbeat quicken and doing nothing. Because sin, they said, could be heard in your breathing. Bundling was never just about the plank. It was about making sure your first feeling of intimacy was also your first taste of fear. And if that sounds suffocating, wait until your wedding night requires legal proof of penetration. Not from you, but from the crowd outside your bedroom door. Imagine living in a world where desire wasn't private, but punishable. Where even the urge to feel was something to fear. And yet, beneath the surface of sermons and sin, people still craved. They still wanted. And so, they turned to their plates. In the medieval world, food wasn't just nourishment. It was medicine. it was magic. And for the desperate, it was hope. Hope that a roasted sparrow's brain could ignite passion. Hope that mixing crushed pearls with goat's milk might spark fertility. Hope that lust once forbidden could be summoned quietly at the dinner table. These were not whispers passed among lovers. They were prescribed in medical texts, recipes documented in the writings of scholars, monks, and court physicians. Because in the Middle Ages the line between medicine and superstition was thin and often crossed, oysters were common, yes, as they still are today. But medieval Europe's aphrodisiac menu extended far beyond the sea. Testicles from animals boiled, roasted, or ground into powder were believed to transfer virility, not metaphorically, but literally. It was thought that by consuming the organs of a strong beast, you inherited its power. Eat the strength, absorb the desire. Some went further. Medieval manuscripts list ingredients like sparrow hearts, powdered antlers, and even fragments of gemstones. Alchemists advised adding gold dust or crushed emeralds to enhance the body's hot humors. Others mixed herbs like saffron, basil, and cinnamon flavors we associate with comfort today, but which were once thought to stoke the flames of carnal hunger. These concoctions weren't luxuries, they were solutions. Because sexual performance was not just a private issue, it was a public matter. Inheritance, legitimacy, honor. They all depended on whether a man could produce an heir. And if he couldn't, it wasn't just shameful. It was suspect. Impotence was sometimes viewed as a curse, a sign of witchcraft, or even punishment from God. So naturally people turned to what they could control, what they ate. But it wasn't only men. Women, too, were prescribed diets to make them more fertile, more desirable, or more docile. Recipes advised newlywed brides to consume honey figs and wine to open the womb. In some cases, women were fed potions made with snake fat, believing it would make conception more likely. It's easy to dismiss this as nonsense, but to them it was sacred science. In the kitchens of medieval castles and farmhouses alike, love was measured in herbs and desperation. Cooking became ritual, meals became spells, and lust, repressed, condemned, and feared, was quietly served on pewter plates. But here's the darker truth. These so-called aphrodisiacs weren't just about pleasure. They were about control. A man who couldn't perform risked exile. A woman who couldn't conceive risked accusations of being cursed. The food wasn't about romance, it was about survival. And like everything else in the Middle Ages, these practices were wrapped in contradiction. The same church that warned against lust also approved the writings of physicians who recommended rooster testicles to cure frigidity. Saints preached chastity, while nobles laced their wine with herbs meant to increase desire. Because in a world where sex was restricted by the heavens, people turned to the earth for loopholes. But for all their efforts, all their recipes and rituals' desire remained unruly. It didn't obey doctrine. It didn't follow the stars. And it certainly didn't wait for permission. Still, medieval people tried. They stirred lust into soup. They boiled it into broth. They swallowed it like salvation. And in doing so, they revealed something universal. That even under the weight of law, scripture, and fear, the human body still whispered its own prayers. Sometimes in the dark, sometimes over dinner, but always out of reach. Next, we move from the kitchen to the bedroom, but not for privacy, for performance. Because in the medieval world, consummation wasn't just sacred, it was witnessed. Imagine it's your wedding night. The candles are lit. The bed is made. You stand beside your new spouse, both of you, young, nervous, and trembling, not from anticipation, but from pressure. Because outside the chamber door, the priest is waiting. So are the witnesses. They need to confirm that your marriage is real. In medieval Europe, love was never just personal. It was legal. It was religious. And above all, it was political. For nobles and royalty, a wedding wasn't truly complete until the marriage had been physically consummated. And in some cases, that meant more than a kiss and a prayer. It meant an audience. These weren't peasant customs. This was state policy. For rulers and landowners, producing heirs was a matter of dynastic survival. If a marriage wasn't consummated, it could be annulled. Territories could be lost. Alliances broken. Wars triggered. So the act itself, intimate, private, terrifying, was sometimes documented like a contract. In France and England, there are records of bedding ceremonies in which the couple was escorted to their chamber by lords, bishops, and relatives. The bed curtains were drawn, the door was closed, and everyone waited, not always in silence. In some regions, sheets were inspected afterward for signs of consummation. In others, loud cheering or singing was encouraged outside the door, as if to sanctify what was happening within. Occasionally in royal courts, a trusted servant or official would be stationed in the room itself to verify the deed was done. To modern minds, it sounds grotesque. But to the medieval world, it was just another form of proof, a seal on the covenant. The logic was simple. If the union produced a child, no one could question it. If it didn't, someone would. In one documented case in the 14th century, a noblewoman's marriage was annulled after she testified that her husband had never touched her. The husband argued otherwise. The court demanded physical inspection. Physicians were brought in. The scandal nearly collapsed a regional alliance, all because of one unanswered question. Did it really happen? Even among commoners, consummation mattered. A man could be taken to court if he failed to perform. A woman, too, could be accused of deception or barrenness. But for the wealthy, consummation wasn't just expected, it was choreographed. The church played a strange double role. On one hand, it condemned lust and promoted chastity. On the other, it demanded sexual proof to validate its sacraments. A marriage without sex was invalid, but sex without marriage was damnable. So the church built a labyrinth of rituals to manage both. In some cases, the priest would bless the marriage bed. In others, holy relics were placed nearby to witness the act. There are even accounts of couples instructed to pray before and after intercourse to ensure the union remained sanctified. But what truly haunts this tradition is the loss of agency. Young brides and grooms, often teenagers, were thrust into a ritual they couldn't control. Their bodies became instruments of alliance. Their fear became part of the performance. And if either failed, if there was hesitation, discomfort, or inability, shame followed. Sometimes annulment, sometimes exile, and sometimes nothing at all. Just silence. A private failure treated as public sin. Because in the end, the consummation ceremony wasn't about love. It was about lineage. It was about power moving from one bed to the next. About bodies sealed into dynasties like wax to parchment. It is tempting to laugh at it, to dismiss it as absurd, theatrical, or cruel. But it reveals something ancient and enduring, that sexuality, when observed and regulated, becomes something else entirely. Not intimacy, not affection, but performance, a moment watched by eyes unseen, measured by traditions older than reason, and weighed against consequences heavier than flesh. So the next time you hear the phrase sealed with a kiss, remember that in the Middle Ages it took more than that. It took witnesses, it took documentation, and sometimes it took the sound of a room going silent. In the medieval world, desire was dangerous, but not just because of the flesh. It was dangerous because it disrupted the divine order. And if you dared to make love on the wrong night, under the wrong moon, facing the wrong direction, you might not be creating a child. You might be creating a curse. Welcome to the era of astrological intimacy. Long before science and medicine split from magic, the heavens were treated like a manual for the human body. Kings consulted star charts before going to war. Farmers read planetary alignments before sowing their crops. And couples, believe it or not, timed their sex lives by the zodiac. Medieval physicians and clerics believed that the stars didn't just govern fate, they influenced fertility, temperament, and the moral quality of the soul being conceived. Sex in this cosmology was not merely physical, it was celestial engineering. Conception under Saturn dangerous. It could lead to cold, melancholic children prone to illness or worse heresy. Mars risky. It might produce violent offspring warriors with too much heat in their blood. Jupiter safer, but still needed balancing. Manuscripts from the 12th and 13th centuries offered detailed instructions. Some charts advised couples to avoid intercourse when the moon was waning or when Venus was in a hostile house. There were even instructions about which days of the week were unlucky, often Fridays associated with Christ's Passion. Having sex during Lent a sin, during a lunar eclipse, possibly demonic. The Church, of course, officially condemned astrology as pagan and heretical. But behind closed doors, bishops and abbots were known to keep their own almanacs. Even Thomas Aquinas, the great theologian, acknowledged that celestial bodies could influence physical matter so long as the soul remained untouched. The contradiction was never resolved. Like so much in medieval life, the rules depended on who was asking and who was watching. For the average couple, astrology became another set of invisible chains. It added a cosmic layer of guilt and uncertainty to a moment already burdened with judgment. Was it a sin to make love on the wrong day, or just a spiritual risk could a child be born under a cursed star because their parents were impatient? There are records of noble women refusing their husbands during certain planetary alignments, fearing they'd conceive a child with deformities. There are midwives' notes warning that a child born during a blood moon would be touched by shadow. In some villages, families held off conceiving altogether during eclipses or solar storms, and it didn't stop at timing. There were instructions for orientation. Couples were told to face east, the direction of Jerusalem, to avoid lying on their left sides, as that was associated with feminine weakness. Even the room itself mattered. Paintings of saints were encouraged. Mirrors were forbidden. Sex then became a ritual of alignment. Of bodies, yes, but also of symbols, directions, days, and fears. It's easy to laugh at this now. But in their world, where child mortality was high and disease was everywhere, every choice carried weight. If your child was born sickly, or strange, or simply too quiet, was it because of fate? Or because you didn't wait for Venus to rise? The horror here is subtle, but deep. Because these weren't just superstitions. They were structures, systems that turned the most human act, intimacy, into a performance for the cosmos. Imagine lying in bed beside someone you love, and not touching them. Because the moon is wrong, because the stars disapprove, because last night's dream warned of fire. You're not just fearing sin, you're fearing the sky itself. And the most terrifying part, even when the stars aligned, when everything was perfect, conception might still fail, and someone would be blamed. Often that someone was the woman. In medieval cosmology, the body was porous. It absorbed energies, spirits, humors. It could be invaded by sin or blessed by starlight. A woman who failed to conceive might be told her womb was cold, or haunted, or turned inward. So couples returned to their charts, to their relics, to their potions. They searched the skies for answers they couldn't find on Earth. Because in a world ruled by fear, even desire needed permission. And sometimes permission never came. In the Middle Ages, sex wasn't just a sin. It was a system that could bring you salvation or ruin your life. And few things were more terrifying to that system than a man who couldn't perform. Impotence in the medieval world wasn't just a personal issue. It was a public scandal, a threat to inheritance, a breach of contract. And for noble families, it could mean the collapse of alliances that had taken years to build. So what did they do? They took it to court, literally. Across medieval Europe, men accused of impotence were put on trial, not metaphorically, not quietly, but in real legal proceedings complete with testimony, medical inspection, and in some cases, public demonstration. In France, there are records of impotence courts where judges ordered men to prove their virility before clerics, midwives, and legal scribes. If a noblewoman claimed her husband couldn't consummate the marriage, she could petition for annulment, but she had to prove it. And so did he. In one infamous case from the 14th century, a man was required to submit to a full examination in court. When he failed to produce an erection, he blamed witchcraft. The court agreed, and the case was closed, not with a divorce, but with an exorcism. But this wasn't rare. It was woven into the legal structure of Christian marriage. If you couldn't perform, you weren't just seen as broken. You were seen as cursed. And curses were serious business. Some believed that witches or jealous rivals could bind the genitals with invisible knots. Others feared demons lurking in the bedroom, draining energy from the body during sleep. To combat this, men were advised to carry amulets, to bathe in herbs, to sleep facing east, to avoid garlic but embrace powdered staghorn and dried wolf penis, because in medieval medicine, potency could be eaten. The results were at best inconsistent, but the pressure remained. Because the body was not yours alone. It was evidence, and while the Church publicly condemned lust and carnal desire, its relationship with sexuality was anything but pure. Which brings us to the brothels. Yes, in many European cities the Church itself ran them. By the 13th century, some cathedrals and monastic orders openly taxed and regulated prostitution. In towns like Toulouse-Cologne, and even London bishops issued licenses, collected fees, and provided moral oversight of sex workers so long as business remained discreet. The logic was simple. Better that men visit a sanctioned brothel than commit adultery with a married woman. Better that lust be contained, taxed, and managed than allowed to spread into scandal. And so behind cloistered walls, holy men turned sex into commerce. Not in sermons, of course, but in ledgers. Some priests kept mistresses. Others fathered children despite their vows. In a few cities, entire neighborhoods were designated as red light parishes, where sin was serviced and sanctified, all under the Church's eye. It sounds contradictory, and it was, because the institution that preached self-denial also understood demand. And in the tension between punishment and permission, the Church found profit. Women, meanwhile, had no such compromise. A woman accused of withholding sex or failing to conceive could be shamed, beaten, or cast aside. If she acted with too much desire, she might be called a witch. If she acted with too little, frigid, useless, dangerous. There was no middle ground, only judgment. So both sexes, though, unequally lived under the weight of expectation, of performance, of control. And for those who failed, there were always potions, spells, amulets, whispered prayers, and whispered threats. Entire markets arose around the fear of dysfunction, markets that sold solutions in bottles, scrolls, and charms. But none of it truly worked, because the real problem wasn't in the body. It was in the culture that refused to let the body simply exist. Sex wasn't pleasure. It was pressure. It was politics. It was power. And in the shadows of that power, desire festered, unspoken, unseen, but always expected. Coming up next, we enter the final chapter. The most dangerous sin of all. Not lust, not impotence, but control of life itself. In the medieval imagination, a woman's womb wasn't just an organ. It was a battlefield, a mysterious, powerful vessel capable of birthing saints or monsters. And like all things feared, it was placed under constant watch. Because if the Church could not fully control desire, it would try to control what came after. Birth, or rather, the prevention of it. Today, we call it birth control. Back then, it was heresy witchcraft, or in some cases, a quiet act of survival. Officially, contraception was banned. Any attempt to prevent conception was labeled a grave sin, one that separated the act of sex from its divinely ordained purpose. The body was not your own, especially not a woman's, but reality has always refused to obey. Behind monastery walls and beneath straw roofs, women shared secrets, folk remedies, recipes passed from mother to daughter, whispered between midwives. These weren't luxuries. They were lifelines. Some methods were brutal, others deeply superstitious. A drink made from pennyroyal or silphium was believed to cool the womb. Others chewed fennel or wild carrot, hoping to block conception. Women inserted softened beeswax wool soaked in vinegar or crushed dates as primitive barriers. Some wore amulets made from weasel bones. Others smeared goose fat mixed with ashes along their thighs and prayed, not because they were promiscuous, but because they were terrified. Terrified of yet another mouth to feed. Terrified of dying in childbirth. Terrified of being cast out if they could not bear a son. These were not sins of lust. They were acts of quiet rebellion. Still, the consequences were severe. Women caught with herbal concoctions could be labeled witches. Midwives who knew too much risked accusations of sorcery. Inquisition records are full of cases where knowledge of the body, especially the female body, was treated as demonic. Because to know how to control fertility was to claim power over something God was meant to decide. And yet the church itself was not consistent. In monastic libraries, you'll find medical treatises written by monks and scholars that list the very herbs forbidden in sermons. Some physicians advised noblemen on spacing out heirs while officially denouncing contraception in public. It was, as always, about who held the authority, who had permission to know. And the horror was not just in the methods, but in the ideology that shaped them. Women were blamed for infertility even when the problem lay with the man. Their bodies were poked, prodded, and exorcised. A womb that failed to produce was called wandering. A woman with too much knowledge of it, dangerous. Desire was seen as male. Women were meant to endure it, not express it. And when they did, when they took agency over their own pleasure or reproduction, they became threats to the spiritual order. One wrong word, one suspicious remedy, and you might find yourself tied to a stake, flames licking your legs. Your womb declared a gateway for demons. This was not medicine. It was control masquerading as theology. The church didn't just fear female desire. It feared female autonomy. And so sex remained chained to consequence. Every act judged by its outcome. Every woman measured by her fertility. A world where you could be punished for bringing life into the world, or for trying not to. And yet through all of this, through fire, fear, and falsehood, women found ways to resist. Quietly, carefully, collectively. Because even in the most oppressive systems, the body remembers what it wants. And somewhere under layers of law and liturgy, the ancient knowledge of survival endured. This is where the medieval war on sex ends, not in flames, but in silence. In the whispered prayers of women who knew that sometimes the greatest sin is to obey without question. And that desire, when weaponized by power, becomes something far more terrifying than lust. It becomes doctrine. So what have we uncovered? Not a list of curiosities, not just bizarre traditions or outdated superstitions, but a system that wrapped chains around the body and called it virtue, where sex was watched, desire was punished, and even love had to be scheduled by moonlight. The Middle Ages didn't fear sin. They feared freedom. They feared what happened when the body stopped obeying the rules, when pleasure escaped the pulpit, when a woman said no, when a man said nothing, and when a kiss didn't come with permission from the stars. This wasn't just about sex, it was about control, about who decides what's holy, and who gets burned for breaking the pattern. And the truth is, those patterns never really died. They changed clothes, they learned new languages, but they still sit quietly in the background, in every law, every shame, every silence we inherit. Because when a society fears the body, it builds rituals to break it. If this story made you uneasy, good. History should never make us feel safe. And if you want more stories like this, the forgotten horrors, the hidden rituals, and the twisted truths buried beneath cathedrals and crowns, click like, hit subscribe, and join us here at History's Hidden Horrors, where the past never rests in peace.